Hey everyone, welcome to Our Small Footprint. My name is Nissa, and if you're new here, we are a family of 8 who live off-grid in Australia. Video today is all around pizza. So I make pizza regularly on my food prep planning and preserving videos. At least sort of once a week is how often we make pizza. Sometimes a little less, occasionally a little bit more. It depends on who requests it. Karvik is a big fan of requesting pizza. So it depends on what we have to put on them too, of course, because we only shop every 6 to 8 weeks. Then toppings for them can sometimes be variable. We are a predominantly dairy-free family because 5 of the 6 children don't tolerate dairy, and neither does Daryl. I tend to use dairy because I can, but generally speaking, nearly everything I make is dairy-free because it's just simpler that way. The kids will have fermented dairy now. They do have milk kefir and yogurt. So the allergist a while back said we could give those a go and see if they tolerate it. They seem to tolerate it fine, which is great for me because it just helps with cost, because coconut yogurt is expensive to make and to buy. So we do that, and they may tolerate more these days now than they did before, but I always say that they can test their limits when they have their own bathrooms and are old enough to understand the consequences of it. For the moment, we limit it. I do, however, have started not limiting the may contain stuff. So we get the food hampers every month. If you want to go back through the channel, you can see we get a food hamper every month, and we don't get to choose what's in it. And a lot of those things have some snacks that are may contain dairy or have small amounts of dairy in them. And I've stopped restricting the kids on those as well. They can give them a go, and then they can assess their own reactions or non-reactions to those items. And I think that it's not so bad because nearly everything they eat is dairy free, so even those small amounts it's not going to build up, sort of thing. So anyway, bit of a squirrel there, which I'm prone to do. This is all to do with pizza and how I make our pizzas, because I get a lot of comments about it. So let's get into it. So with my pizza dough, I have been working on it for quite a while, which is why I didn't really sort of, get into it too in depth with in videos previously, because I've been working on the ratios of it. I do love sourdough pizza, but I have been having problems with getting my routine going with my starter and things like that. Weather changes and just life in general has changed recently, and things are a little bit more challenging, I'm finding, to get my planning correct for the sourdough. So this recipe can be used with starter or with yeast, and lately we've just been making it yeasted, which means that it's the same day or the day after, whereas if it's done with sourdough, then generally speaking I'm doing it the day before for the next day, and it can sit in the fridge for up to sort of 3 or 4 days before it's no longer viable. When I make it sourdough, I just do a normal swap. I swap 100 grams of starter in and remove 50 grams of water and 50 grams of flour. So keep that in mind. I'll make a note of it when I put the recipe in the comments. But for sourdough, I just swap out the equivalent amounts of flour and water and add the 100% hydration sourdough starter. I will make it of an evening though, and let it do its proof overnight, and then shape it the next morning. But as I said, my planning has been lacking lately, and the decision of making meals and my sourdough starter is being neglected, and we're using a lot more just straight yeasted recipes so that I can do them the same day. Depending on timing, if it's the same day and we're in the cooler seasons, I do use lukewarm water. I just let the kettle go briefly until the water is about body temperature and use that. Make sure you don't do what I did the other day and not check the water temp, because if it's too warm, your yeast won't work and your dough will be a flop. You would end up with sort of cracker style pizzas out of that though, so not completely a loss. So I start off by adding 700 grams of water to the bowl. I add 30 grams of salt. You can reduce that if you want. This is the level that I like for this quantity of dough for a pizza. I wouldn't add that much for a bread, but for a pizza this is what I like. 50 grams of oil, 20 grams of sugar, and 10 grams of yeast. The sugar is optional, but it will help, especially if you're doing it same day, to get that fermentation boost, but it also helps with the browning of the crust and those little bits of burnt bits and stuff in the crust. The sugar helps with that. Then I put 1100 grams of flour on top, and I put it in the KitchenAid to come together. This quantity will make 8 250-ish gram balls, which is perfect for our family. That's 1 pizza per person, but obviously it can be halved or quartered as needed. The other thing about this dough is that flour is variable. I generally start with 1100 grams of flour, but I regularly have to add another 50 grams of flour to get the texture right. All flours behave differently, but the weather impacts things too. So sometimes 1100 grams of flour is absolutely perfect, and sometimes it just needs that little bit more. You want this to be easy to handle. You don't want to be introducing too much extra flour or anything when shaping it. We do use semolina for dusting, which adds a nice sort of a crunch to the dough, but I try not to add too much flour otherwise. So after about 2.5 minutes of kneading, I assessed the dough and felt that this batch really needed that little bit of extra flour to make it more easily handleable. So now sometimes just kneading for longer can also counteract that feeling of needing more flour. The gluten builds and it gets less tacky. But I'm really not looking for a long knead dough here for pizza. Pizza should be a fairly nice, quick meal, in my opinion. Though comparatively speaking, like each pizza is pretty quick. When you're making 8, it does tend to drag it out a little. So I added 50 grams of flour into the dough and let that go as well. Again, theoretically, I could probably just start with 1150 grams of flour, no matter what, because it's in the ratio wise of the dough. 1100 grams flour will give you around about a 65% hydration. 1150 will give you like a 61, and there's not that much difference between those two in general. But again, it depends on your dough and things like that. But it's make a call. You can start with the 1100 and assess it, and then put the 50 in and make a call, and then maybe you might just want to start with the 1150 all along. The dough that I use, the flour that I used is the Costco baker's dough. The flour that I use is the Costco's baker's flour because it's nice and inexpensive. But it is, whilst it's higher protein than an all-purpose flour, it's not particularly high protein. I let it knead for another couple of minutes in the KitchenAid with the extra 50 grams of flour, and it was just where I wanted it. It's still slightly tacky, but it's not leaving chunks of dough behind on my fingers. I oiled my container for proofing. This Canberra container was a gift from Susan, and it was much appreciated. It is a perfect size for bulk doughs. Because I was doing this video purposely to make sure my recipe was accurate to share, I also weighed the total dough ball to make sure it was reflective of the 250 grams per 8 balls, which it was. Put the lid on it and put it aside to not quite double. Because we're going to shape these and put them in the fridge, even in the fridge they will increase at least somewhat. So you don't need it to be doubled on the bench, but you do want it doming sort of nicely. You want bubbles visible throughout the dough, and it to have definitely have gained sort of at least 50% volume. I sprinkled a container with some semolina for the second proof and tipped the dough out onto the mat. You can see it doesn't hold itself very well, but it isn't sticky either. This is sort of my happy medium, hydrated enough to be malleable and a tender dough, because that's how I like my pizza crusts, but I don't want to have to fight the dough to shape it either. I weigh the dough balls out as I go, just so we end up with mostly even ball sizes. A little bit of variance is fine, but I don't want them to be too far off. I want them to be nice and taut little balls. So what I do is I drag the edges all underneath the dough to get that nice tight layer on top, and then I use my hands to drag the dough. Some people do this on the surface of a bench, but I find it easier on my wrists and shoulders to sort of scissor my hands almost so that those edges are all pinched underneath the dough, holding that structure of the dome on top, using semolina on the base of the container and on top of the balls, just so that if they proof and touch each other, they don't stick as bad. It always gives a nice crunch on the pizza stone as well when you're cooking them off. This container works really well for proofing pizza dough for me, but it is just a storage container from the cheapy store. It's definitely not food grade, but I'm not heating anything in it, and so it's fine by me. I will eventually get some of the food grade plastic containers from a catering wholesaler, but it just isn't something I've been moving on recently. They're fairly expensive, and storage and space before we get the kitchen organized is kind of a hard one. So I will have a couple of demonstrations of how I shape those balls of dough as well, because I did get a comment on one of the other videos where I was showing that I don't always get the angle right to show that. So just showing the way that I tuck all the dough underneath the ball, and then I use my hands to drag those pieces of dough into the middle so that it's nice and pinched and tight underneath and tight skin on top, so that it has that domed shape and it will hold its shape well. The container goes straight into the fridge to be pulled out sort of 30 minutes before I cook dinner. So this is about lunchtime that I did this, and I could theoretically not refrigerate them and cook them in about an hour or so, depending on the weather, but I do find it easier to prep them earlier in the day and then pull from the fridge. It also means that if I don't get to pizza tonight as planned, I can use it the next day if needed. Yeasted doughs, I don't find them good too much past that. Sourdough lasts quite a few days in the fridge if need be, but I do find that yeasted doughs don't have that longevity. The next day is fine, but you take it too long and the gluten starts to collapse and they get sticky and they don't roll out well and things like that. Now, because the kids and Daryl don't have dairy on their pizza, I make either a nacho cheese style sauce or a mayo for them to have. For lunch this day, we ended up having fish tacos. So I made mayo up for that to then use for dinner. So I made my normal stick blender mayo, a couple of eggs, some Dijon mustard, some cowboy candy, some of the garlic fermented in honey, lemon juice, and a bit of salt. I blended that up and slowly added the olive oil while continuing to blend. This makes a really big jug full for us, which works well because we can go through a lot of mayo. It also sort of shows why I buy so much olive oil. But this will fit into sort of 2 or 3 jars in the fridge. A lot gets used on the drizzle for pizza, but also we were using them with those fish tacos for lunch. All right, getting ready to start cooking the pizzas. The dough has been out for a little while and we're sitting at about 5 p.m. I get all the toppings we want to use. So we've got caramelized onion jam, marinated mushrooms, homemade pizza sauce, tin corn, pineapple that I'd canned and drained because the kids fight over juice. There's some anchovies. I've got some shredded ham that I cooked up, some zucchini butter, and some of the rump steak that I've been using over the last few days, sliced nice and fine. I also have some of the roasted corn kernels that are left over from the fish tacos and some salami as well. I generously semolina the board. I want this pizza to easily launch into the pizza oven, and semolina is fairly inexpensive, so if there's a little bit of waste, then I'm not overly concerned. I place one of the balls onto the board. I use my fingers to create a well in the middle and then slowly stretch the dough out, hand in the middle and gripping the crust to drag it out, stretching it until it's the relevant size. You can see how well the dough tolerates this, though the first dough of the night is always a little less tolerant than the last one because there's like an additional 30 minutes of bench time between the first and the last one, just in the time that it takes to make the pizzas. I used a bit of pizza sauce as well as zucchini butter on the base. The kids were all doing chores, so this is just a bit of what I know. The kids will eat pizza rather than questioning them for exactly what they want. Everyone loves salami. All the kids have pineapple, but Daryl and I don't. I'm really not a fan of warm pineapple on my pizza. Tin corn is a bit of a controversial one as well. I've seen when I've shared pizzas before, people either love it or hate it, but I really like it and the kids do too. Daryl isn't a huge fan. He doesn't generally have corn on his though. I also broke up bits of the rump steak over the top. I did pre-cook this because the pizza will cook quickly in the pizza oven, and so having the toppings pre-cooked is always handy for making sure that you don't burn the pizza trying to get the toppings cooked. I definitely go for a less is more when it comes to these pizzas and bases. As I said, because it's in the pizza oven, it cooks quite fast. So you want that crispy bottom, tender top, and if you have too many toppings, then the top just ends up a bit soggy underneath the toppings. If you've got raw stuff on there, then it releases liquid and makes it a bit soggy, or if there's just too much on there, it doesn't work. So we definitely take that sort of less is more when it comes to the pizza toppings, just to make them cook well in the pizza oven without that soggy factor. I don't appear to have taken any footage of the pizza going in for some reason. I will see if I can find some, but I do have a whole video about the Baker Stone pizza oven that I use, so I'll try and link that. It's the one that sits on top of the barbecue with the built-in pizza stones. It had a bit of a learning curve initially, but once we figured out how hot I needed it and that I needed the hood closed on the barbecue to keep it hot enough and things like that, I really like it. And if my barbecue was big enough, I'd run 2 of them on there so that I could cook 2 pizzas at a time. That would be ideal, but only one will fit on the current barbecue. I got through all the kids' pizzas, so I thought I'd show you Daryl's. Again, I put the pizza sauce and the zucchini butter as the base. He likes anchovies. The anchovies have broken up into little pieces. I think it was the heat over summer on the shelves, but they're fine. It just means that I'm basically putting like an anchovy paste on his pizza. Marinated mushrooms. These were canned with some vinegar and oil, some garlic and some onion. It works well for things like this. I'm not a fan of onions, but a fan of mushrooms, but Daryl really is. So it's nice to have it on the shelf. There's a couple of kids that like the mushrooms on theirs as well. The rump steak pieces went on there as well, and being that Daryl and my pizzas are done last, I could be a little bit more generous with that because I had probably skimped a bit on the kids just to make sure there was enough to go through for all 8, and we ended up with a little bit of surplus in the end. Salami, which I should have put on the bottom and forgot, and a sprinkle of the ham that I had fried up so it was sort of like bacon as well. I only got footage of cutting mine because it was the last one and everyone else had eaten or cut their own. So mine has cheese on it, but it shows how good they look coming out of the oven. The crust edge puffs up and is airy, but the base is crunchy and flexible. I'm really happy with this version of the recipe and it works well for me every time, which is why I decided to share it. So that is the recipe that I'll put in the comments for the pizza dough. So I've been working on it for quite a while. I get asked about it because I show it in the videos all the time. And I wanted to make sure that the ratios that I was using were correct because I have a tendency to throw things in, especially with doughs, and do it all by feel. So I needed to make it by the measurements a few times in a row to make sure that it was going to work consistently before I shared it, because I hate sharing things and not being sure if it's going to work for someone else. So the flour does make a difference. As I said, I use the Costco baker's flour. You can use an all-purpose flour for a pizza base. It's going to be more tender and less chew to it because of the lower protein level, and you may find that you need to reduce the water quite significantly because all-purpose flour just doesn't take the hydration as well as a baker's flour does, probably to do with that protein level. But I find that the Costco baker's flour works quite well. It isn't top of the line, but that's what I use to make all my breads, and it is inexpensive, which is a big thing for me because I buy sort of 50 kilos of flour every 8 weeks, and so we're a week off the next supply run, and I've got 2/3 of a barrel left, and it filled 3. So we don't go through quite that much in a shopping period, but we can, depending on what we've done in that time. So sort of 50 kilos of flour, if I was buying high-end flour, it would blow my budget way out. So the flour, I can't remember what the 25 kilo bags are worth now because it used to come in 12.5 kilo bags and it was around about $12 for the 12.5 kilo bags. The 25 kilo bags are a very similar equivalent in pricing, inexpensive in the scope of flour anyway. It would be nice at some point to get a grain mill and be able to grind some whole wheat berries to add into my baker's flour, just to add a little bit of the nutritional bump to the baker's flour. But I think I'd still just buy the Costco baker's flour anyway to bulk up things because it's just so inexpensive. So there's that, that ebb and flow of what you're adding in and what you're using based on budget versus, what you need. And a grain mill are expensive, so it's going to be a long time off before I can afford that as something as well. And with the kitchen the way it is, it's probably not something I should be looking at just yet anyway. So anyway, squirreled a bit there. So that is pizza, and I didn't get as much footage of the actual pizzas and the cooking and stuff as I would like, but I'll try and find some bits and pieces I can add in there for you as well. The geese are going off the nuts, so I don't know why. So thank you for watching again, guys, and I will see you on the next video.